Does your Toyota Corolla have intake cam gear rattle? Sounds like this. I'm going to show you how to fix it without buying a new cam gear and without having to remove the cam gear from the engine to repair it. Okay, so what you're going to do is take the valve cover off, pull your spark plugs out, and you're going to get a wrench and you're going to be able to rotate this thing like this easily at the cam gear. And then you're going to notice there's two lines on that cam gear. There's one right there and there's one right there. And the spring is adjacent, the next bolt over, that's where the spring is going to be located. So we're going to start by taking these bolts out first, and then we're just going to rotate clockwise, and we're going to take them all. We'll take that last bolt out where that spring is, and that spring should be up here on the top side. And then we're going to either replace it or we're going to stretch it or we're going to do something with it, and that's going to cure the intake cam gear rattle. To remove the cam gear plate on the intake cam gear, this is the toolkit I bought, and this is the one I used. It is that size right there, 30 IPR, and it's a 5-point Torx. Okay, so I got the last bolt out, and I'm going to remove, like, you can remove this little plate, and you can see that little spring there. So we're going to remove the plate, and then we're going to pull that spring out and take a look at it. So what the purpose of that park pawl in your cam gear is when your engine is shut off, that little pin is supposed to lock the cam gear with the variable vanes part of the cam gear so that it can't move. It locks it solid, because when your engine is shut off, when you go to start it again, it takes a few seconds for oil pressure to get to that cam gear to both sides of it, so that the ECU can modulate where it wants that camshaft based on how it's tuned. So I just want to show you this little video clip here from another YouTuber who took one of these apart just to show you what the internal workings of it is. And in this part of the video you can see what's causing the rattle, because he wiggles it back and forth. And this is the result of a weak spring.
So if you push it all the way down, there's really not much play there. I'm sure that's very important. And without the spring, it just...
See right there where you hear that little rattle sound? Where you hear that little rattle sound there, that's the sound that you're hearing when you start and you hear that little cam gear rattle, is that little pin is walking out because that spring is not pushing that park pawl down.
It just pops up by itself, so you can kind of see. Come on. There we go. So that's it all the way down, and if I just rotate it a bit, that pin will eventually pop up. So that's the idea of the spring, I suppose.
If you didn't have that pin locked in when your engine was shut off, your cam gear would walk around, and he's going to turn it here. See how he turns it? It would rock back and forth between those two spots, and it would eventually break these little arms off on all your cam gear. And if that happens, well, you have catastrophic engine failure. You have valves crashing into pistons. So this is why you need to fix this problem, because if that little spring doesn't do its job and that piston comes out and it's not locking, it could potentially rattle itself apart like that, and you're gonna break stuff. Okay, so I took that little spring out of there, and that's the little piston that's in there that goes into a locking, like a park pawl for your cam gear, so that the pawl locks, so that this variable valve timing cam gear can't rock back and forth when the engine is shut off. And what happens is I took that little spring out already, and I moved that piston back and forth. It moves freely, so I'm going with the conclusion that the spring is just too weak. And here's the spring right here. So what I've done on past vehicles is I've actually taken that spring and I just stretched it a little bit. So you just take it and you grab it, and then you take it and you stretch it like that. I can't do it with two hands here. I'll show you in a minute. Okay, so here's that spring, and what you do is you take it and you stretch it like this. You pull it, stretch it just a little bit, and then you put it back in, and then that'll give it enough tension that it'll push that that piston in its place where it's supposed to be, and you won't have that intake cam gear rattle anymore. And that's how you cure this without changing any parts, without buying a new gear or anything. Okay, so you slide your new spring in, or your stretch spring, or you can add a pen spring, which is what I did. I stretched it and added a spring out of a pen, and that gave it just a little bit more tension to push on that piston to go into its park position. And now we're going to put the plate back in and bolt it back down and put the valve cover back on, and we're done. Okay, so what I want to do is keep the orientation of this plate the right way. I'm trying to get it so I can show you, but right there you can see the little circle where the spring was pushing on the plate. And I'm going to make sure that that lines up with that spring there. So I'm going to clock this thing like this. It is in the right position, and then I'm going to slide it in. And you can see the spring is pushing that plate out. I'm going to grab one of my bolts, and then I am going to get this sucker started. Yeah, and you want to be real careful while you're doing this, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to drop that spring down into the timing chain area. Otherwise, you're going to be taking stuff apart to go find it, because you don't want that thing getting between the chain and the cam gear, although it'll probably just destroy the spring, but you still don't want those little medical particles floating around in your oil. And I'm just going to show you this here. This is a 5-point, looks like a Torx, but it's 5-point, and Toyota used 5-point probably because they didn't want anybody tampering. You're not supposed to service these gears like this. You're just supposed to buy a new one from Toyota. That's the way they designed it, I guess. And apparently the new gear, the updated gear, just has a stiffer spring in it, and that's how they corrected it. But they want you to buy that gear from them rather than just fixing the one that you have with a part that is totally fine. So I'm going to get that snug, and then I'm going to roll this cam over by hand. Okay, so now because Toyota doesn't give, well, Toyota probably doesn't have a torque spec for these bolts, because you're not supposed to take these cam gears apart. You're only supposed to replace them. I'm just going to go ahead and do this by hand because they didn't feel very tight when I loosened them. So I'm just going to use a 1/4-inch ratchet, and I'm just going to snug it fairly tight by hand. And I'm just going to do that to all of them. And yeah, I've done lots of stuff by feel before. These are not very big bolts, so you don't want to go too tight on it because you will break them, but I am using a 1/4-inch ratchet. If you really want, you could probably take a torque spec of a similar size bolt and use that, but I'm just going to opt to do it by hand because I've done so many of these tiny little bolts by feel. It's not a big deal. Really, the only thing I use a torque wrench for are cylinder head bolts and cam gear bolts and crank bolts and stuff like that. Stuff where the torque actually matters, but stuff like this, where you're just holding something together that doesn't have a lot of stress on it, I do by feel. Just like my valve cover bolts, I do those by feel too. I don't use a torque wrench on those. And that just comes from years of experience of doing thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs. You know, if you want to get really technical and check your work, supply air to that port right there. And when you supply air to it, it's going to push that little pin in that way, and then you're going to be able to clock the spring or clock the camshaft back and forth like that. And then once you release it, you can push it back and you'll hear that pin click into place, and it'll go click, and then that locks the cam with the cam gear, and it's in the park position and it's ready for startup. Okay, so what you want to do next now is you want to clean all your gasket surfaces, and you want to reinstall your valve cover, and you're ready to go after that. Okay, now you test fire. And that's how your engine should sound when it starts. No rattle. This is the next morning, no rattle anymore. It's all fixed. Day 2 verifying. If you like my DIY content, please hit like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.